The room fell silent the moment Beyoncé laughed. Not the kind of laugh you hear during a concert, or in a music video, or in a documentary clip polished by her team. This was different. This was sharp, unexpected, and directed at one person standing just a few feet away. Meghan Markle. What happened next would ripple across Hollywood faster than a leaked studio memo. And before the night ended, before the invitations were even cold, executives at Amazon MGM Studios would quietly make a decision that would leave Meghan stunned, furious, and scrambling for relevance. They pulled the plug. Immediately. No explanation. No reshoot offers. No, let's revisit this next quarter. Just done. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But why? Why would a billion-dollar studio cut ties with a woman who once commanded headline after headline, who sat across from Oprah, who walked into the royal family and became the most talked-about woman on the planet? And what does Beyoncé have to do with this? More than Meghan ever expected. More than anyone outside that room was supposed to know. Tonight, we are diving into the one story that has Hollywood insiders whispering, publicists sweating, and industry giants distancing themselves like the room is on fire. Because the truth is simple. Meghan Markle wasn't just canceled. She was quietly blacklisted. And Beyoncé's unexpected comment wasn't the cause. It was the trigger. Let's go back. Because if you really want to understand what made Amazon MGM snap the cord, if you want to understand the shift in Hollywood's energy around Meghan, you have to understand the lead-up. The tension. The pattern. The way people in the industry watched her rise, watched her fall, and finally decided enough was enough. But first, let me ask you something. Have you ever seen someone walk into a room they believed they owned, only to realize everyone else in that room was waiting for them to fail? That uneasy silence? That sideways glance? That smile that doesn't reach the eyes? That's exactly how Meghan's night began. She wasn't supposed to be there, not officially. But in Hollywood, crashing an event isn't the scandal, doing it badly is. She arrived hoping to reclaim something she felt slipping away: status, influence, validation. The kind of validation she believed only Hollywood could give back to her. But the moment she stepped in, people noticed something. A shift, a discomfort, a tightening of posture among A-listers who had once greeted her with warmth. Not because she was unwelcome, but because she was unpredictable. And Hollywood hates unpredictability more than scandals, more than lawsuits, more than bad publicity. People forget something important. This town is built on relationships, not attention. Anyone can trend. Anyone can go viral. But access? That's earned. And recently, Meghan hadn't been earning it. That night showcased everything. She approached circles where conversations froze the moment she entered. Smiles felt thin. People touched their phones more than they made eye contact. She tried to speak to certain producers, people who once invited her to private dinners, and instead she got polite nods. Quick exits. Awkward pauses. Then there was Beyoncé. Let's be clear, Beyoncé isn't just a celebrity. She's an institution. Her presence shifts temperature. Her approval can elevate careers. Her silence can ruin them. And when Meghan walked toward her, confident, poised, ready to reclaim a connection she believed was still strong, Beyoncé smiled. A smile that meant absolutely nothing. Because Meghan didn't know what had already been said behind the scenes. She didn't know the conversation Beyoncé had with someone earlier that night. She didn't know the comment that had been passed around entertainment circles for weeks. A comment involving Meghan, her behavior on set, and an incident connected to her Amazon MGM project. You'll hear that later. But it's important to know this much now. Beyoncé wasn't impressed. Not anymore. And that brings us to the moment. The joke. The line that echoed louder than anyone expected. The line that made half the room gasp and the other half pretend not to hear. But we're not there yet. Because before that moment, before Meghan's humiliation, before the quick glance Beyoncé gave that said everything without a single word spoken, the industry had already been shifting. This wasn't an overnight collapse. This was the final crack in a foundation that had been shaking for months. What changed? You see, Meghan thought the entertainment world would open its arms to her after she left the royal family. She expected applause. She expected admiration. She expected the industry to view her as untouchable because she had stepped into the biggest spotlight on earth and survived it. But Hollywood didn't see a survivor. They saw a pattern. They saw the Oprah interview. They saw private conversations turned into public headlines. They saw staff departures. They saw lawsuits. They saw unpredictable behavior. They saw Meghan claiming she wanted privacy while launching media projects. They saw the contradiction. And Hollywood hates contradictions. It makes them nervous. It makes them wonder, if she can turn on the royal family, what stops her from turning on us? And that question alone is enough to make studios hesitate, agencies back away, and publicists brace themselves. But Meghan wasn't aware of this perception shift. Or maybe she was, just not enough to adjust her strategy. Instead, she doubled down. She pursued new deals, pitched new concepts, and tried to position herself as Hollywood's newest powerhouse. Which brings us to the Amazon MGM contract. Behind closed doors, this deal wasn't as stable as fans believed. Executives had concerns. Not about talent. Meghan is charismatic, polished, prepared. But about reliability. About audience trust. About the uncontrolled narrative risk, as one internal document labeled her. 3 months before the contract was pulled, an executive raised a warning. Public sentiment is volatile, he said. She is polarizing. We need consistency, and she doesn't bring consistency. Still, the project moved forward. Tentatively. Until that night. Until the moment Beyoncé said something Meghan would never forget. A line Meghan misinterpreted as shade, but Hollywood insiders interpreted as confirmation. Because Beyoncé wasn't trying to be cruel. She wasn't trying to humiliate Meghan. She was trying to distance herself, publicly, subtly, strategically, and Hollywood noticed. Now let's talk about the energy in that room. Meghan attempted to join a circle of A-listers deep in conversation. They parted slightly, but the warmth wasn't there. She tried again with another group. More muted reactions. More awkward pauses. A photographer approached, but not for her. She posed anyway. The photographer hesitated, then took one photo, reluctantly. That was the moment people realized something had shifted. Even the air felt stiff. Like everyone knew something Meghan didn't. And then, the moment that set the stage for total collapse. Meghan made a comment. A light, harmless comment, but it fell flat. Beyoncé heard it. She turned. She gave a look that said more than a speech. Then she said the line. The joke. The spark. People laughed. Not loudly. Not enthusiastically. Just enough. Enough to sting. Meghan froze. You know when someone tries to pretend they're fine, even as their entire face betrays them? That was Meghan. She smiled. She tilted her head. She tried to play along. But she wasn't playing along. She was trying to survive the moment. And then people started whispering. Not loud enough for Meghan to hear, but loud enough for those around her to shift uncomfortably. This was the moment her night turned into a timeline. Because minutes later, someone who had recorded the exchange, intentionally or not, sent the audio to someone else. Within 20 minutes, it reached a major studio executive. Within an hour, it reached Amazon MGM. And before Meghan even left the event, her contract was already being discussed. Words like risk, liability, and optics began circulating. She had no idea. Not yet. But she could feel something. You can always feel the moment the room turns against you. She sensed it in Beyoncé's smirk, in the quick glances between producers, in the way 2 directors whispered after she walked past them. She didn't know what they were whispering about, but she was about to find out. Because the real story, the one that would lead to Hollywood quietly shutting its doors, hadn't even begun to unfold. And what came next would change everything the night Meghan walked into that event. She believed she was reclaiming something she had lost. Not fame, not relevance. Something deeper, something invisible. The sense that when she entered a room, people shifted, straightened their shoulders, smiled wider, raised their eyebrows in admiration or curiosity. She believed the world still viewed her as someone extraordinary, someone powerful, someone with weight. But power only exists when others believe in it. And on that night, the illusion shattered the moment she stepped across the threshold. She didn't feel it at first. The cameras flashed. The lighting hit perfectly. The kind of lighting that makes even the most exhausted celebrity look ethereal. Meghan held her head high, posture perfect, expression soft but commanding. She knew how to play to cameras. She mastered that art long before she ever met Prince Harry. But the eyes of the room told a different story. Not admiration. Not awe. A strange mixture of discomfort and curiosity, like people were trying to decide whether they should greet her or avoid her. It was subtle, very subtle, but Meghan had once been an actress. She knew how to read people. Her instincts flickered, something was off, but she pushed the feeling away. She was here to mingle, to reconnect, to reclaim the spotlight. The problem? She didn't know everyone else had moved on. Minutes after she entered, Meghan headed for the first cluster of A-listers. A director she had met years ago spotted her. Meghan smiled warmly, ready for a conversation. He smiled back, briefly, then glanced at his watch and excused himself. Maybe he had somewhere to be. Maybe it was coincidence. Meghan shrugged it off. Then it happened again, and again, and again. But denial is a stubborn thing. Meghan ignored each micro-rejection the way people ignore a cold breeze, convincing themselves the wind isn't getting stronger. She pushed through the crowd, determined to speak to someone who mattered. She spotted a well-known producer, one she once had brunch with, back when her Hollywood future looked bright and open. She approached with confidence. She greeted him by name. He blinked. He smiled politely. Polite is never good. Polite is Hollywood's way of saying, I don't want to be rude, but please don't pull me into anything complicated. The conversation lasted 13 seconds. 12 of those seconds were filler. Empty pleasantries. Air disguised as substance. Meghan wasn't used to this. For years, she'd been surrounded by people who wanted things from her. Access, proximity, publicity, photographs, royal association. Suddenly, the energy around her had changed. She wasn't being pursued. She wasn't being admired. She was being tolerated, and she felt it, but she pretended not to. Then the moment shifted entirely. Beyoncé arrived. In any Hollywood event, Beyoncé's arrival is a gravitational shift. Conversations pause. Heads turn. Security tightens. The air changes. Meghan felt that shift immediately. She could feel the crowd subtly aligning toward Beyoncé's direction. And so did she. Because Beyoncé was more than a celebrity to Meghan. Beyoncé represented validation. If Beyoncé greeted her warmly, if Beyoncé embraced her, the room would soften. Approval from Beyoncé wasn't just approval. It was currency, power, social oxygen. Meghan waited for the right moment, then moved toward Beyoncé's circle. A circle she believed she still belonged to. But something was wrong. Beyoncé's body language was calm, poised, gracious, but distant. Not hostile, not dismissive, just neutral. Beyoncé's neutrality cuts deeper than most people's insults. Meghan tried to join the conversation anyway. She offered a comment, light, harmless, meant to be funny. Something she used to say among the royals that always earned at least a polite laugh. This time, it didn't. The group went quiet. Not cold quiet. Confused quiet. The kind of quiet that says, wait, was that for us? The awkwardness lasted maybe 2 seconds. But for Meghan, it felt like 2 minutes. She tried again, this time directing a comment directly at Beyoncé. Beyoncé turned toward her. Smiled. A perfect Beyoncé smile, graceful, poised, unreadable. And that was when she delivered the line. The line that would soon travel across Hollywood. The line Meghan wished she could erase. The line that made 3 people gasp softly. The line that would trigger everything that followed. Now, the world still doesn't officially know what Beyoncé said. Meghan knows. Beyoncé knows. Everyone in that circle knows. But Hollywood's power isn't built on public statements. It's built on private truths whispered between people who matter. But to understand why Beyoncé said what she said, you have to understand the build-up. Because in the weeks leading up to that night, something had been happening behind closed doors. People were talking. Industry figures Meghan believed were allies had started expressing concerns about working with her. Studio executives had flagged her as unpredictable. Agencies were whispering about creative disagreements and communication issues. Publicists shared stories about sudden changes, last-minute demands, shifting narratives. And then, quietly, discreetly, but unmistakably, someone in Beyoncé's circle shared a story about Meghan. A story that bothered Beyoncé. Not because it was scandalous, but because it revealed something Beyoncé couldn't align herself with. When Beyoncé speaks, she speaks with strategy. When she distances herself, she does so with precision. Her joke wasn't an accident. Let's go back to the moment it happened. Meghan finished her comment. A harmless comment, in another world. Beyoncé looked at her, tilted her head slightly, and delivered a one-sentence reply. A sentence layered with humor, truth, and razor-sharp subtlety. The group laughed. Meghan didn't. She tried. She smiled. She shifted her posture. She nodded as if she understood the humor. But inside, something cracked. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Quietly, like glass under pressure. She knew the room had changed. She knew Beyoncé had sent a message. She just didn't know how far that message would travel. Because someone was recording. Not obviously. Not intentionally at first. Just someone filming the room, capturing candid moments, as people often do at these exclusive events. The recording captured Beyoncé's joke. It captured the group's reaction. It captured Meghan's frozen expression. It captured the shift. That recording would become the most circulated clip among Hollywood insiders within hours. But none of this had happened yet. Meghan was still standing in the moment, still trying to salvage the energy around her, still hoping to find someone in the room who could remind her she mattered. She excused herself from Beyoncé's circle. She moved toward the bar. She checked her phone. No new messages. She took a breath. Then came the next blow. A well-known actress walked by. Someone who used to greet Meghan with warmth, and instead gave her a tight smile and kept walking. Not unkind, just uninterested. Meghan approached another group. The conversation pivoted when she joined, but not toward her. Around her. Past her. Like she was invisible. For the first time in years, Meghan felt what it was like to be on the outside. And she hated that feeling more than anything. She tried to locate Harry, but he wasn't there. This was her moment. Her night. Her chance to prove she could still navigate Hollywood alone. But Hollywood had already made up its mind. And Meghan didn't realize she was walking into the beginning of the end. Because as she tried to rebuild her confidence, as she tried to force herself back into conversations, as she tried to pretend that Beyoncé's joke hadn't stung her deeper than any tabloid headline, someone across the room was sending the recording to an Amazon MGM executive. A choice that would change everything in the next hour. But the real twist wasn't that Hollywood was laughing at Meghan. The real twist was that someone in the room, someone Meghan trusted, would be the next person to turn on her. And their betrayal would hurt far worse than Beyoncé's joke that if you think Hollywood forgets easily, think again. It doesn't. Not truly. Every misstep, every whispered comment, every moment of tension, even the ones that happened years ago, gets filed away. Somewhere. In private conversations, in hidden notes, in mental ledgers that executives, agents, and A-listers carry with them like weapons. And Meghan Markle, as she navigated the glitzy corridors of Los Angeles and Beverly Hills, had no idea how heavily that mental filing system weighed against her. Let's rewind for context. Meghan arrived in Hollywood not just as a celebrity, but as a symbol of the impossible. She had left the royal family, made headlines globally, and walked into a town where fame is currency and scandal is interest. Hollywood was ready for her, in theory. The cameras, the magazine covers, the interviews, they were all waiting. But what Hollywood noticed, quietly, behind closed doors, was not just ambition. It was patterns, repetitions, predictability and unpredictability. And this was the very thing that began to erode the goodwill Meghan assumed she carried like armor. People started whispering. Directors who once offered her leads began to hedge their bets. She's talented, one executive said privately, but she's difficult, unpredictable, not in a fun way. Publicists shared anecdotes about sudden changes in plans. Something as minor as a wardrobe choice or a scheduling demand became magnified because of her reputation for controlling the narrative. And Hollywood, for all its glitter, is merciless when it senses inconsistency. Audiences can forgive a flop. Studios cannot. Not when there's a risk of legal entanglements, bad press, or internal chaos. Meghan believed she was building an empire. But in Hollywood, perception is reality. And perception is sculpted in whispers. One of the most important things to understand about Hollywood is how loyalty works. It isn't based on kindness, charm, or even raw talent. It's based on predictability, on trust, on the understanding that if someone says they will do something, they will do it without causing embarrassment, surprise, or disruption. Meghan's early years in the public eye had been carefully curated under palace guidance. Protocol, schedules, meticulous attention to optics. Hollywood had never experienced Meghan at full unleashed. And that unleashed energy, initially charming to some, quickly became a liability when she tried to transplant it into a new ecosystem. A few weeks before the infamous event with Beyoncé, whispers about Meghan began circulating with increasing frequency. A prominent director at a studio brunch mentioned, "She's talented, great energy, but you never know which Meghan you'll get on a set." The comment seemed harmless at first, but in Hollywood, that statement spreads. Within days, agents, producers, and executives began sharing stories of late arrivals, sudden cancellations, conflicting demands, and press leaks tied to Meghan's projects. By the time she entered the room where Beyoncé would deliver the fateful joke, several insiders had already decided that working with her was a risk they couldn't afford. And these weren't just rumors. They were documented in private notes, whispered in meetings, and logged in mental ledgers by powerful people whose silence was deliberate and deadly. Meghan, naturally, was oblivious. She believed the charm of her name, the gravity of her royal past, and the headline potential of her persona would overshadow any minor missteps. She thought the public would continue to be fascinated, the press would remain loyal, and Hollywood would accommodate her quirks because she had fame. But she underestimated the subtle mechanisms of Hollywood's memory. People remembered not just what she did, they remembered what she could do again. Then there were the smaller, subtler issues. Every wardrobe decision, every public statement, every interview became a chess move. A misinterpreted joke in a magazine, a tweet that drew criticism, a public disagreement. Each tiny incident, when filed alongside other incidents, began to create a composite image. A portrait that studios could read like an intelligence report. And while Meghan focused on the next project, Hollywood focused on the cumulative effect. Patterns don't lie. Reputation, in Hollywood, is persistent. Meanwhile, the Amazon MGM project loomed large in the background. This was her golden ticket, or so she thought. Executives had initially been impressed by her ambition, by her pitch, by the potential star power she brought. But private concerns started creeping in. Production staff quietly noted delays in pre-production meetings. Legal teams whispered about contractual nuances that seemed tricky. Publicists quietly strategized around possible PR hurdles. Every warning sign was logged, cataloged, and analyzed. And then came the event. It wasn't just any gathering. This was an A-list congregation where careers were launched and ended with casual glances. And as Meghan arrived, unaware of the growing scrutiny, she carried her confidence like armor. She approached familiar faces, smiling, joking lightly. But the smiles were thin. The conversations were clipped. The warmth she expected had been replaced with polite acknowledgement, a careful neutrality. And in Hollywood, neutrality is deadly. It's a precursor to exclusion. The tension intensified when Beyoncé entered the room. Not for Meghan specifically, but her mere presence shifted everything. Conversation stopped. Eyes turned, energy realigned. Meghan's instinct was correct. Approval from Beyoncé could make her night. But instead, Beyoncé's smile was measured, distant, controlled. Not dismissive, not cruel, but impenetrably neutral. And that neutrality carried a message that Meghan wouldn't fully decode until it was too late. When Meghan finally tried to engage Beyoncé's circle, the interactions were awkward. A comment meant to be lighthearted fell flat. The group went quiet. Eyes flicked around. Laughter, when it came, was polite, shallow, restrained. Meghan attempted to save the moment, but the damage had already been done. In that instant, she could feel the invisible shift. The room, which she believed she could command with her persona, had subtly closed in around her. Unbeknownst to Meghan, someone in that circle was recording. Casual at first. Just a snippet, capturing what seemed like a fleeting moment. But that snippet would become the spark that ignited a chain reaction. Within hours, executives at Amazon MGM would view it. Within a day, the conversation would shift from entertainment gossip to executive action. The recording, paired with the whispered stories from previous months, created a picture that was impossible to ignore. And Hollywood's memory is precise. That night, every misstep from Meghan's past, every perceived inconsistency, every rumor and anecdote was reinforced. She was no longer an unpredictable but charming newcomer. She was a liability, a risk. Someone whose presence could tip the balance in a room where appearances, optics, and social proof dictate power. What Meghan didn't realize, what she couldn't have seen from her position at the center of the room, was that this moment, the laughter, the whispers, the glances, was merely the public face of a private decision that had been forming for months. Amazon MGM was already leaning toward canceling her contract, and Hollywood insiders were quietly distancing themselves. The joke, subtle as it seemed, was confirmation, and the ripple effect was immediate. Meghan left that night feeling a mixture of confusion, embarrassment, and determination. She still believed she could reclaim her influence, still thought she could navigate the industry on her terms. But the damage had been done. A subtle exclusion had begun, a chain of events she couldn't yet trace, and by morning, the consequences would start to hit. But what Meghan didn't know yet, what no one outside the room could predict, was that one person she trusted implicitly would be the next to betray her. And that betrayal would set the stage for the real fallout. The secret blacklist, the canceled contract, and the swift fall from Hollywood. Meghan believed that stepping into Hollywood after leaving the royal family was like entering a kingdom ready to be claimed. She had fame, notoriety, and a persona the public could never ignore. And yet, Hollywood operates differently. Here, the rules are invisible, unwritten, and enforced quietly, but with devastating precision. Fame alone doesn't guarantee entry. Connections can open doors, but only if you know which doors to push and which to let slide shut. Timing, perception, alliances, and whispers matter more than talent. And Meghan was learning that the hard way. In the weeks leading up to the infamous event, Meghan made a series of strategic moves she believed would cement her comeback. She reached out to A-listers she thought of as friends. She pitched ideas for streaming projects with recognizable brands. She smiled for every camera, posted perfectly curated social media updates, and tried to project an aura of control. But Hollywood, unlike the royal court, doesn't forgive inconsistencies, or at least, not silently. Every interaction, every casual remark, and every misstep is cataloged. And Meghan's pattern, which might have been charming in London, looked unpredictable and volatile in Los Angeles. She tried to reach out to Beyoncé. The attempt was subtle. A message through a mutual contact, a note about a potential collaboration, something casual but friendly. Meghan imagined that Beyoncé, always polished, always strategic, would appreciate her initiative, maybe even admire it. Instead, what she didn't know was that Beyoncé had already been briefed about the previous month's concerns. She had been listening quietly to whispers from her team, from mutual contacts, and from other industry insiders. Beyoncé was aware of Meghan's inconsistencies, of the whispered reports of diva-like behavior, of the tension she left behind on sets and at events. To Beyoncé, Meghan's approach wasn't charming. It was risky, and risk is contagious. Meanwhile, Hollywood insiders weren't silent. Gossip in Hollywood is rarely idle, it's currency. Studio executives, producers, agents, and publicists shared stories about Meghan in private, often emphasizing her unpredictability and the difficulties of working with her. "She's talented," one prominent agent remarked, "but she's a liability if we don't know which Meghan we're getting." Another producer whispered at a private dinner, "She's wonderful for headlines, but can she handle the cameras, the studios, the schedules without blowing up the set? I don't know." The comments might have seemed small, almost trivial, but in Hollywood, small things accumulate. Patterns emerge. Consensus forms. And before Meghan even attended the event, the narrative around her had quietly shifted from fascination to caution. Despite all this, Meghan pushed forward. She believed charm could overcome anything, that grace could smooth over whispers, and that audacity would always impress. She scheduled meetings, attended galas, and tried to embed herself within circles where her name alone might carry influence. Yet with every step, she faced subtle resistance. Smiles were thin. Introductions were brief. Conversations that should have included her felt clipped and contained. She could sense the hesitation, the unspoken question in the air. Can we trust her? Will she respect the room? Or will she make this about herself again? On the night of the event, this tension reached its peak. The room was packed with A-listers, executives, and influencers, all silently weighing each other's value, assessing power dynamics, and silently deciding who belonged and who didn't. Meghan arrived dressed impeccably, radiating confidence. She moved through the room like she owned it. But perception is fragile. One misstep can alter everything. And the moment she tried to insert herself into conversations, the reality of her situation became painfully clear. For instance, when Meghan approached a director she had previously worked with on a minor film, she expected warmth. Instead, she was met with polite, measured responses. A handshake, a brief smile, and a quick shift of attention elsewhere. To anyone else, it might have seemed trivial. To Meghan, it was an unmistakable signal that her perceived status was no longer absolute. Every gesture in Hollywood is magnified, every reaction amplified. And that night, the magnification was brutal. Then came Beyoncé. Her presence was magnetic, as always. Conversations halted, eyes turned, and the subtle currents of attention shifted. Meghan, recognizing the opportunity, approached, hoping to reconnect, hoping to impress, hoping to regain an ounce of credibility in a room where every glance was a measurement. But what she didn't know was that Beyoncé's team had already been informed about concerns surrounding Meghan. The energy in the room had been preconditioned. Beyoncé's smile was gracious, poised, controlled, but deliberate, neutral, non-committal, not dismissive, but also not welcoming. Meghan tried to engage the group with humor, light conversation, and gentle charm. Her efforts, however, fell flat. The laughter was forced, the smiles thin, the glances calculated. She attempted again, trying to direct her energy toward Beyoncé. And that was when the joke was delivered. The subtle, layered comment, sharp enough to sting, light enough to appear casual, reverberated in the room. Laughter erupted, polite but pointed. Meghan tried to mask the sting, to maintain composure, to appear unfazed, but she couldn't. Not fully. Not when the joke landed so precisely on her current Hollywood predicament. What Meghan didn't realize at the time was that the joke's impact was compounded by history. Years of whispered stories, private anecdotes, and quiet observations suddenly coalesced. Hollywood has a way of remembering patterns. That one comment, delivered at the right moment, acted as a trigger, validating the private concerns that executives had been quietly documenting. A flurry of subtle, behind-the-scenes communications was set in motion, moving faster than Meghan could perceive. By the time she left Beyoncé's circle, the room had already made judgments that would reverberate across studios, networks, and agencies. At the same time, Meghan attempted to seek validation elsewhere in the room. She approached other clusters of celebrities, executives, and agents. Each attempt was met with increasingly subdued reactions. Conversations pivoted past her. Polite nods replaced engagement. She could sense the shift, but not its magnitude. She still believed her charm could overcome whispers. She still believed her presence demanded attention. But Hollywood's memory is long, and its judgment can be swift. And somewhere in that room, someone recorded the exchange. Not obviously, not maliciously, just a snippet captured on a discreet phone. But in Hollywood, recordings travel. One clip can move from a private moment to boardroom discussions in hours. The subtle laughter, the muted reactions, the thin smiles. All would become part of an internal narrative being constructed in real time. A narrative that would soon reach Amazon MGM executives. A narrative that would quietly, decisively, begin to unravel Meghan's standing. The night ended. Meghan left, still hopeful, still believing in her influence, still convinced that charisma, charm, and strategic engagement could restore her Hollywood foothold. But the undercurrent had shifted. The tides had turned. And by morning, the consequences would begin to appear, unseen but powerful, shaping her fate in a way that no charm, no royal past, and no carefully curated media appearance could reverse. Hollywood had remembered, and Hollywood was already preparing its next move. Behind every sudden Hollywood cancellation, there is usually a trail of warning signs. Contracts don't get pulled spontaneously, at least not in billion-dollar studios. And Meghan Markle's Amazon MGM deal was no exception. From the outside, it appeared sudden, shocking, even unjust. From the inside, it had been simmering for months, a quiet pressure building behind closed doors until it reached a critical point. It began with the pitch. Meghan arrived with confidence, proposals, and star power. Executives were intrigued. Here was a woman who had walked away from royalty and carried the world's attention with her. Who wouldn't want her on a streaming platform project? At first glance, she seemed a perfect addition. But executives quickly realized that there was more to consider than celebrity status. Early meetings raised concerns. Notes were made, quietly, about her behavior, her requests, and her management style. Some were minor, almost negligible, changing schedules last minute, insisting on exclusive branding clauses, requesting specific camera setups, demanding particular crew members be on set. In isolation, these wouldn't have mattered. But patterns began to emerge. A note from a production assistant mentioned a tense moment during a preliminary read. Meghan had argued over a line, calling it tone-deaf, and refusing to perform until it was rewritten. Another note referenced an earlier Zoom call where she dismissed a director's suggestion, claiming she knew exactly how this should be done. These were small issues, almost trivial, but Hollywood watches, and Hollywood remembers. In addition to behavior, executives started analyzing audience perception. Meghan's name alone could attract attention, yes, but also scrutiny. Streaming platforms rely not just on star power, but on audience engagement, retention metrics, and long-term profitability. Internal memos began to surface, quietly, suggesting a potential risk: the unpredictability of her public persona. Her past interviews, her media appearances, and the highly publicized royal departure painted a polarizing image. Executives asked, would the audience embrace her projects, or would negative sentiment lead to reduced engagement? By the time the A-list event occurred, the event where Beyoncé delivered the now-famous joke, the internal pressure was already mounting. Amazon MGM had watched, analyzed, and evaluated every public appearance, every leaked headline, and every social media post. The recording of that night didn't create the problem, it amplified it. It confirmed what the executives had been quietly debating. Meghan might be more liability than asset. After the event, conversations intensified. Emails circulated, discussions were held in closed conference rooms. Legal teams flagged clauses in the contract that allowed for material risk to brand or project reputation to be used as justification for cancellation. The language was vague, broad, and strategically inserted. A safety net, a loophole, a preemptive measure for a situation just like this. Inside Amazon MGM, executives debated. Some wanted to give Meghan another chance. Others pointed to the growing list of minor incidents that suggested a pattern. It's not just tonight, one executive said. This has been building for months. She's unpredictable. Our project could be jeopardized. Another replied, we can't have our entire brand reputation hinge on someone whose behavior could backfire at any moment. At the same time, publicists whispered about optics. What would the press say if this escalated publicly? Could this be spun into a positive narrative? Or would it be a PR nightmare? They considered the audience reaction, social media backlash, and the potential for leaks. Every decision had to balance risk versus reward, perception versus reality. And Meghan's name had become more risk than reward. While the studio deliberated, Meghan remained unaware. She believed the event with Beyoncé had been minor, perhaps awkward, but manageable. She assumed her charm, her persistence, and her connections could overcome any minor missteps. What she didn't understand was that the executives weren't reacting to one joke or one evening. They were responding to a cumulative assessment of risk, behavior, and predictability. Then came the tipping point. The recording of Beyoncé's joke, already circulating among Hollywood insiders, arrived in the hands of key decision-makers. They didn't see humor. They saw confirmation. They saw the patterns they had been tracking for months manifested in a single moment. It was the proof they needed to act decisively. Executives called an emergency meeting. Legal advisors outlined options. Public relations strategists assessed possible fallout. Producers considered continuity. Marketing teams recalculated the project's audience engagement projections. Every department weighed in. And the decision, once unanimous, was terrifying in its clarity. The contract had to be terminated. Immediately. Not weeks from now. Not with a careful negotiation. Immediately. For Meghan, this would feel sudden. Publicly, it would appear abrupt. But behind closed doors, the decision had been months in the making. It was the culmination of private evaluations, whispered concerns, and careful observation. A slow burn process that ended in what seemed like instant consequence. What made it worse for Meghan was the way Hollywood functions. She wasn't given a public explanation. No one called. No memo arrived in her inbox explaining the rationale. Instead, a quiet retraction appeared internally. Teams were told not to contact her. Meetings were canceled. Future projects were quietly shelved. The effect was subtle yet brutal. It was exclusion without confrontation, cancellation without drama, the silent treatment, amplified to institutional proportions. And the industry watched. Studios, producers, and agents took note. If Amazon MGM was cutting ties, the signal was loud and clear. Others would follow. Doors that had once seemed open quietly closed. Offers that had been floated disappeared from inboxes. Invitations to collaborative projects became scarce. The echo of one decision reverberated across Hollywood like a silent tsunami. Meanwhile, Meghan's team scrambled. Calls went unanswered. Emails were ignored. Attempts to negotiate were politely declined. What she had assumed was a secure foothold, a multi-million-dollar deal with one of the largest entertainment companies in the world, vanished almost overnight. And the reason, though obvious in hindsight, was a mixture of accumulated risk assessment, optics, and Beyoncé's carefully measured comment, which had become the symbolic trigger. But the story doesn't end there. What made this cancellation especially devastating was the subtle, invisible ripple it created. Internally, Hollywood insiders began whispering about Meghan's unreliability. Agents reconsidered signing her. Directors hesitated before offering auditions. A-listers adjusted their event appearances. The cancellation wasn't just a single event. It was a domino effect, a slow, methodical blacklisting that would make it increasingly difficult for Meghan to regain footing. By the time she realized the contract had been terminated, the landscape had already shifted. She would never see it coming, not entirely. She would feel it. Yes, the absence of invitations, the thin smiles, the polite declines, but the full magnitude of the institutional exclusion would take months to unfold. And it all began with months of quiet observation, subtle internal memos, and a single moment amplified by a joke that traveled faster than anyone anticipated. And yet, as devastating as this was, it was only the beginning. The real impact, the whispers, the isolation, the subtle but powerful shift in her reputation, was still spreading. And in Hollywood, reputation is everything. Lose it, and even the most ambitious star struggles to reclaim a place in the spotlight. What Meghan didn't yet realize was that the event with Beyoncé, the internal discussions at Amazon MGM, and the quiet buildup of months of scrutiny were not isolated occurrences. They were connected. Every meeting, every memo, every private discussion had led to this moment. And what came next would escalate beyond contract cancellations. It would redefine Meghan's standing in Hollywood entirely. If there's one rule Hollywood enforces above all else, it's loyalty. Not friendship, not admiration, not even talent, but loyalty. Who supports whom? Who shows up when it counts? Who stays silent when discretion is needed? These invisible codes dictate survival in the entertainment world. And Meghan Markle, despite her fame, her royal history, and her media prowess, was learning that loyalty is not automatic. It's earned. And when it's absent, it can strike faster than any scandal or gossip column. The night of the event, the subtle currents of loyalty were already shifting. Executives had made preliminary decisions regarding Meghan's project. Producers were cautiously disengaging. Agents were reconsidering future offers. Even peers, those she once considered allies, were whispering in private, sharing concerns, exchanging knowing glances, subtly adjusting their behavior. No one wanted to appear disloyal publicly, but privately, the narrative was clear. Meghan had become a liability. And Beyoncé, perhaps more than anyone, had observed it all. She had watched the buildup of minor incidents, the rumors, the patterns of behavior, and the subtle tension in Hollywood circles. She had also witnessed Meghan's attempts to secure her approval, messages, meetings, small gestures meant to demonstrate alliance. But in Beyoncé's carefully calibrated world, loyalty isn't demonstrated through outreach. It's shown through respect for the ecosystem, understanding boundaries, and maintaining discretion. And Meghan had violated several of these unspoken rules. When Meghan finally approached Beyoncé at the event, it wasn't just about personal connection. It was about influence. Meghan believed that if she could secure Beyoncé's support, she could shift the room's perception, rebuild bridges, and regain footing in Hollywood. But she misjudged the dynamics. Beyoncé's response was measured, polite, yet contained a clear boundary. Neutrality, in this case, spoke volumes. It signaled to the room, and to Meghan herself, that influence is earned, and support can be withdrawn as easily as it's offered. Hollywood's memory is relentless. Every past misstep, every awkward interaction, every inconsistency in behavior is filed, remembered, and used as reference. Executives who once tolerated minor irritations now saw patterns. Agents who previously overlooked diva tendencies now considered them red flags. And when Beyoncé's joke landed, it wasn't just humor. It was a subtle but definitive confirmation of what insiders had been observing for months. Meghan was unpredictable. Her behavior could be problematic, and she could no longer be counted on to navigate the delicate ecosystem of Hollywood smoothly. Before the joke, Meghan had tried to control the room with charm. After the joke, she struggled to regain control of the narrative. Her body language, which had once projected confidence, now displayed subtle tension. She laughed, nodded, smiled, but inside, she was recalibrating. She was attempting to salvage influence that had already begun slipping through her fingers. Every glance from a producer, every whisper among assistants, every subtle shift in posture told her that she was no longer fully welcome in the circles she once commanded. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of the night had already begun. Behind closed doors, executives at Amazon MGM were reviewing recordings, emails, and past memos. Legal teams discussed clauses, considering reputational risk and material liability as justifications for contract adjustments or termination. Publicists and PR consultants debated narrative control, considering both internal communications and potential leaks. Every department weighed in, quietly building the case that the contract could no longer stand. Meghan, oblivious to these developments, believed the night's awkwardness could be smoothed over with charm, emails, and future meetings. She underestimated the speed at which perception travels in Hollywood. By the time she realized the magnitude of the situation, the narrative was already being solidified behind closed doors. Loyalty in Hollywood is transactional. Beyoncé's subtle distance sent a signal to the room, to executives, and to the broader industry. It said, "We observe patterns. We make judgments. Support can be withdrawn if the ecosystem demands it." For those who had been monitoring Meghan's behavior, it reinforced what they already suspected. The joke wasn't malicious. It wasn't cruel, but it was definitive. It confirmed that Meghan's influence could be questioned and, more importantly, that loyalty was conditional. And while Meghan tried to maintain her composure, the room began to shift around her. Agents, once eager to offer guidance, remained silent. Directors, once open to collaboration, were hesitant. Executives, already considering internal measures regarding the Amazon MGM project, quietly advanced their discussions. Every interaction, every glance, every micro-reaction fed into the narrative. Meghan was no longer the untouchable figure she believed herself to be. In Hollywood, the private and public overlap. What seems minor in one context can be amplified in another. The combination of past incidents, current behaviors, and the immediate fallout from Beyoncé's comment created a perfect storm. Meghan's influence, carefully cultivated and assumed to be unshakable, was now fragile. And as insiders began quietly distancing themselves, her network, once a source of power, started to constrict. The subtleties of Hollywood influence are often underestimated. It's rarely about a single comment or an isolated incident. It's about patterns, perceptions, and trust. And in this case, every prior misstep, every perceived inconsistency, and every minor indiscretion now converged. The ecosystem was shifting. Doors that once opened effortlessly now remained closed. Invitations that had been extended were rescinded or quietly ignored. Networks that had been assumed supportive became cautious, measured, and ultimately distant. Yet Meghan's perception of the night differed sharply from reality. She left the event believing she had navigated the challenges successfully, that charm, poise, and grace had maintained her status. But Hollywood had already made its judgment. Executives had reviewed the recording, cross-referenced it with prior memos, and quietly moved toward decisive action. The subtle signals of loyalty and influence, once assumed permanent, had shifted irreversibly. And in that moment, one truth became clear: Hollywood does not tolerate unpredictability. Influence must be constantly managed. Reputation must be carefully curated. And loyalty, true loyalty, is earned, respected, and never taken for granted. Meghan had underestimated all three. What she didn't yet know was that this miscalculation would cascade. Not only would it impact her Amazon MGM deal, but it would also begin a chain reaction. A-listers, directors, producers, and executives would quietly take note, adjusting their behavior, communications, and decisions in anticipation of further instability. One seemingly minor moment, the joke, a laugh, a glance, had confirmed what insiders had feared. And the ripple effects were only beginning. The real danger, however, lay not in the immediate fallout. It lay in the silent erosion of influence. Hollywood works quietly. Deals are canceled, opportunities evaporate, invitations fade, and slowly, methodically, a carefully built reputation crumbles. By the end of that week, Meghan would begin to notice that subtle shifts were no longer subtle. She would feel it in emails that went unanswered, calls that were deferred, and meetings that were postponed indefinitely. The ecosystem she had assumed would protect her had quietly started to turn. But what Meghan didn't know, what no one could yet predict, was that the next phase of this story would escalate beyond canceled meetings and hesitant executives. The internal mechanisms that had been quietly working against her were preparing to strike in ways that would reshape her Hollywood trajectory entirely. The room was alive with the usual buzz of Hollywood A-listers. Laughter, clinking glasses, and quiet murmurs of deals being made, opportunities being weighed, and influence quietly asserted. Meghan walked through this world like she had done so many times before, poised, polished, exuding confidence. But nothing about this evening would be ordinary. Not for her, not for the industry, and certainly not for Beyoncé. It began with a conversation circle near the center of the room, where influential producers, directors, and actors had congregated. Meghan moved in, confident, ready to reclaim her space, to make her presence felt, to remind everyone why she belonged in this echelon of Hollywood. She smiled, laughed lightly, tried to engage. For a brief second, it seemed she might succeed. But then Beyoncé arrived. Her entrance wasn't loud, flashy, or performed for effect. It was subtle, controlled, yet magnetic. Heads turned. Conversations faltered. Energy shifted like a tide moving in a controlled current. Beyoncé's presence alone reasserted the hierarchy. Those who had been central moments before now adjusted their positions slightly, unconsciously deferring attention to the superstar. Meghan, sensing the opportunity, moved closer, attempting a connection. She made a small joke, a light, harmless comment directed at the group, hoping to insert herself, to draw laughter, to remind them she could still command attention. And that's when it happened. Beyoncé responded. The line was simple, yet devastating in its impact. Delivered with a poised tilt of her head, a perfectly measured smile, and subtle emphasis, it landed with precision. The joke was funny, yes, but it also carried layers of truth and observation that only those present could fully appreciate. In the blink of an eye, Meghan's intended command of the room evaporated. The group laughed, not loudly, not mockingly, but just enough to send a ripple of discomfort through Meghan. Enough to indicate the shift in influence. Enough to make her realize she was not the center of this space anymore. Meghan froze for a split second, a micro-expression that registered shock, confusion, and a hint of embarrassment. She tried to laugh it off, to tilt her head in acknowledgement, to regain composure. But Hollywood doesn't just respond to recovery, it responds to perception. And the perception at that moment was that Meghan had miscalculated. She had assumed familiarity where boundaries had shifted. She had assumed influence where deference was no longer owed. The subtle stings of the moment were compounded by the presence of a recording device, discreetly held by someone in the circle. The laughter, the reactions, Meghan's frozen smile, and Beyoncé's comment were all captured. And in Hollywood, recordings are rarely kept private. They travel, silently, with power, influence, and discretion shaping their path. Within hours, key executives at Amazon MGM would see the clip. Within the day, it would circulate in private conversations among agents, producers, and A-listers. The joke had become both symbol and confirmation. Meghan's reputation in this ecosystem was fragile. Meghan attempted to regroup. She shifted to another cluster of industry professionals, her posture still confident, her smile still poised. She tried again, speaking lightly, laughing, engaging. But the reactions were different. People who had once welcomed her energy now maintained polite neutrality. Conversations pivoted away from her, subtly, almost imperceptibly. Invitations for deeper engagement did not materialize. Micro-moments of inclusion were withheld. She didn't yet fully understand the magnitude. She assumed charm, social skill, and her carefully curated presence could compensate. She believed she could navigate the aftermath with grace, recalibrating her positioning in the room. But Hollywood's memory is relentless. Every past indiscretion, every reported misstep, every anecdote and whisper from the previous months suddenly found context in Beyoncé's line. The joke wasn't just humor. It was validation for those who had been quietly evaluating her behavior. Meanwhile, the ripple effect began internally within Amazon MGM. Executives viewed the recording not as entertainment, but as evidence. Evidence of behavior, of social dynamics, of influence shifting unpredictably. The clip confirmed what legal advisors had already flagged: a potential reputational risk, a liability in a high-investment project, and a variable that could destabilize production or public perception. Within hours, meetings were convened to discuss contract implications. Notes were circulated. Emails were sent discreetly. Decision-makers weighed options carefully but urgently. Meghan, oblivious to this internal storm, attempted a graceful exit from Beyoncé's circle. She moved toward the bar, hoping a casual refreshment could provide a momentary reprieve from the social tension. Yet the environment itself had shifted. Conversations paused as she approached. Eyes flicked briefly, then returned elsewhere. Smiles were tight. Introductions were polite, but devoid of warmth. The subtle isolation that had begun months earlier was now evident to her senses. In that moment, a critical realization began to form. Meghan could feel the difference in energy, the slight tightening of postures, the restrained attention. Something had changed, she could sense it. She wasn't being ostracized openly. Hollywood rarely executes exclusion with overt hostility, but she was being measured, evaluated, and, ultimately, distanced. Her attempts at charm no longer yielded influence. Her social capital, once considered robust, was quietly being depleted. What made this moment especially poignant was that the recording now existed, unobserved but potent. Hollywood insiders understand that perception, once documented and corroborated, becomes fact in private evaluations. The laughter, the reactions, the subtle shifts, all of it would be analyzed and referenced in internal discussions. By the time Meghan realized what had transpired, decisions would have already been made. Actions would be underway that she could neither anticipate nor prevent. Yet Meghan persisted. She navigated to another cluster of professionals, attempting to reassert her presence, to regain control of the evening. She laughed, made light comments, and projected warmth. But the subtle cues of disinterest, careful neutrality, and measured body language communicated volumes. Hollywood's feedback is rarely direct. It operates through micro-reactions, through the silent withdrawal of engagement, and through calibrated indifference. Meghan was experiencing all three. And then came the tipping point. An executive, previously scheduled to discuss her Amazon MGM project, passed through the room. Meghan attempted engagement, but the interaction was curt. Conversations were clipped. Smiles were absent. The subtle distancing had moved beyond casual interactions. It was now institutional. Actions were being taken, decisions were being considered, and influence was quietly being reassigned elsewhere. By the time Meghan realized the significance of the evening, the landscape had already shifted. The combination of Beyoncé's strategically measured comment, her own miscalculated attempts at control, and the quiet, systemic evaluation by executives created a perfect storm. Influence that had seemed permanent was now fragile. Networks that had seemed secure were now tentative. Opportunities that had appeared guaranteed were quietly rescinded. Hollywood had delivered its verdict. Subtle, strategic, and devastating. Meghan, despite her attempts to maintain control and poise, could not reverse the trajectory. The night had become the symbolic culmination of months of private observation, whispered concerns, and quiet strategic assessment. And yet, what made the situation even more dramatic was what Meghan didn't know. The ripple effect had only just begun. The recording, quietly circulating among insiders, would now catalyze further decisions. Deals, collaborations, and opportunities that had once been within her grasp would now begin to evaporate. The silent mechanisms of Hollywood exclusion were activated, and the next wave of consequences would escalate far beyond a single evening or a single joke. The real blow, however, was still to come. The recording had not only validated existing concerns, it had become the instrument that would quietly dismantle Meghan's credibility and project security. And while she was still unaware, executives at Amazon MGM were moving decisively. Because in Hollywood, influence is fragile, loyalty is conditional, and reputation is everything. And Meghan was about to learn that lesson the hard way. In Hollywood, nothing ever truly stays private. Every whisper, every glance, every subtle micro-expression can, and will, become part of the narrative that shapes careers, influence, and power. For Meghan Markle, the realization came quietly, but sharply. She was no longer in control. The joke, the laughter, the thin smiles, all captured in a recording circulating faster than she could imagine, had triggered something far bigger than embarrassment. It had set in motion a cascade of decisions that would define her Hollywood trajectory. As she left Beyoncé's circle, attempting to regain composure, Meghan felt the subtle but unmistakable shift. People no longer leaned in to listen when she spoke. Conversations pivoted past her. Introductions she expected were delayed or ignored. Invitations she had assumed would arrive had not materialized.